My hands were shaking as I stood in front of that ATM machine at 3 in the morning. The card felt like a piece of ancient history between my fingers, the magnetic strip so worn I could barely see the bank's logo anymore. 23 years. That's how long this card had been sitting in my wallet. Forgotten, collecting dust, waiting for this exact moment. The moment when I had absolutely, nothing left to lose. Let me back up because you need to understand how I got here. How Carter Bennett, a guy who thought he had his entire life figured out, ended up standing outside a closed bank in the middle of the night with $43 in his checking account and nowhere to go. You need to understand what my wife did to me, what I discovered about my mother. Before we dive in, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now because this story is going to take you on a journey you won't forget. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let me know if you've ever been go through this situation. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why that question matters, and how one worn-out ATM card would reveal secrets that had been buried for over 2 decades, 72 hours before this moment. I was living in a beautiful craftsman house in Portland's Pearl District. My wife Olivia and I had been together for 14 years, married for 12 of them. She was a pharmaceutical sales executive, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and command attention without saying a word, designer clothes, perfect hair, the type of confidence that comes from knowing you're the smartest person in any conversation. I was a guidance counselor at Lincoln High School, helping kids figure out their futures while apparently being completely blind to my own. That Tuesday started like any other Tuesday. I woke up at 6, made coffee, got ready for work. Olivia was already up, sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop, typing furiously. She'd been working on some big presentation for weeks, stressed about landing a major contract with a hospital network. I'd been trying to support her, taking care of everything at home, so she could focus on her career. Walked over and kissed the top of her head, something I'd done every morning for 12 years. She didn't look up. There's coffee in the pot, I said. Do you want me to make you something to eat before your meeting? She kept typing. I grabbed an energy bar from the pantry this morning. I stood there for a moment, waiting for something more. Eye contact maybe. A thank you, anything. But she was locked into her screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard like I wasn't even in the room. I taught my classes that day, met with students, helped a senior figure out her college application essay. Normal stuff, good stuff, work that actually mattered to me, even if it didn't come with a 6-figure salary. I came home around 4:30 like I always did, already thinking about what to make for dinner. The house was quiet when I walked in. Too quiet. Olivia's car was in the driveway, which was unusual for that time of day. She normally didn't get home until 7 or 8. Sometimes later. Liv, I called out. You home? In the living room. Something in her voice made my stomach drop. It wasn't angry or sad. It was flat, emotionless. The tone you'd use to tell someone the copier was broken, or you were out of milk. I walked into the living room and stopped dead. Olivia was sitting on the couch, perfectly composed, wearing one of her power suits. Next to her was a man I didn't recognize, probably in his 50s, expensive suit, leather briefcase on the coffee table. And on that coffee table, arranged in a neat stack, were papers. A lot of papers. Carter, sit down, Olivia said. This is Richard Holbrook. He's my attorney. My brain couldn't process what was happening. Your attorney? Why do you need an attorney? Richard leaned forward, his expression professionally sympathetic, in that way that immediately made me distrust him. Mr. Bennett, I understand this is unexpected, but Mrs. Bennett has decided to file for divorce. We're here to discuss the terms of separation. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually sat down, not because Olivia told me to, but because my legs stopped working. What are you talking about? Liv, what is this? She looked at me then, really looked at me, and her eyes were completely cold. Carter, I want a divorce. I've wanted one for a while now. I just finally got the courage to do something about it. But why? What did I do? We can talk about this. We can go to counseling. I don't understand what's happening right now. Richard held up a hand. Mr. Bennett, I know this is difficult, but Mrs. Bennett has made her decision. What we need to discuss now is the division of assets and the terms of separation. Looked at Olivia, searching her face for any sign of the woman I'd married. The woman who told me she loved that I was a teacher, that I was doing something meaningful with my life. The woman who'd cried at our wedding when she read her vows. But that woman wasn't there. This person sitting across from me was a stranger. Liv, please. Talk to me. What happened? What changed? She sighed like I was being deliberately difficult. Carter, nothing happened. That's the problem. Nothing ever happens with you. You wake up, you go to work, you come home, you grade papers, you go to bed, every single day for 12 years. Do you understand how suffocating that is? I was trying to be supportive. You were always so busy with work. I wanted to make sure you had space to focus on your career. My career. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Carter, I make $370,000 a year. You make $62,000. I've been carrying this marriage financially for over a decade while you play guidance. Counselor to teenagers, the contempt in her voice when she said guidance. Counselor made something crack inside my chest. I thought you respected what I did. I respect teachers, Carter. I just don't respect being married to one. Not when I'm at the level I'm at. Do you know what it's like to go to company events where everyone's spouse is a doctor or a lawyer or an executive, and I have to introduce you as a high school counselor? Do you know how small that makes me feel? Richard cleared his throat. Perhaps we should focus on the practical matters at hand. Mr. Bennett, this house was purchased 8 years ago with a down payment that came entirely from Mrs. Bennett's signing bonus. The mortgage payments have been made primarily from Mrs. Bennett's income. The investment accounts, the vehicles, the vacation property in Bend, all funded by Mrs. Bennett. Wait, I interrupted. Oregon is an equitable distribution state. Even if she made more money, I'm entitled to a fair share of marital assets. I contributed too. I paid for groceries, utilities. I maintained the house. I made it possible for her to focus on her career without worrying about anything at home. Richard smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. Mr. Bennett, equitable doesn't always mean equal. Given the significant disparity in income and the source of funds for major purchases, Mrs. Bennett is prepared to offer you a settlement of $75,000. In exchange, you'll relinquish all claims to the house, the investment accounts, the vehicles, and any future spousal support. $75,000. 12 years of marriage. That worked out to about $6,000 per year. I actually laughed because it was so absurd. That's insane. Liv, you can't seriously think this is fair. She looked at me with something close to pity. Carter, it's more than fair. You came into this marriage with nothing. You're leaving with $75,000 and no debt. Most people would consider that generous. I need time to think. I need to talk to a lawyer. Richard shook his head. The offer expires today. If you don't accept by 6 p.m., Mrs. Bennett will proceed with litigation. And I can assure you, Mr. Bennett, that will not go well for you. We have documentation of every financial transaction over the past 12 years. We can prove that your contributions were minimal at best. If this goes to court, you'll walk away with nothing but legal debt. Olivia checked her watch. An Omega I'd saved for months to buy her for our 10th anniversary. It's 4:45 now, Carter. You have a little over an hour to decide. I looked at the papers on the coffee table, then at Olivia, then at Richard with his smug expression. Where am I supposed to go? This is my home. The house belongs to Mrs. Bennett, Richard said. However, she's graciously arranged for you to stay at an extended stay hotel for the next week while you figure out your living situation. After that, you'll need to make other arrangements. The next hour was a blur. I tried to call a few attorneys, but no one could see me on such short notice. I tried to talk to Olivia to understand how we'd gotten to this point, but she'd gone upstairs and locked herself in our bedroom. Richard sat in the living room checking his phone, waiting. At 5:57, I signed every page. I signed away my home, my marriage, 12 years of my life. Because I couldn't afford to fight. Because I was terrified of ending up with nothing. Because somewhere deep down, I believed what Olivia had said. That I was insufficient, that I'd been carried through this marriage by her success, that I didn't deserve more. Richard handed me a check for $75,000 and the address of the hotel. Mrs. Bennett has packed some of your belongings. They're in the garage. The locks will be changed tomorrow morning. So please don't attempt to return to the house. I walked out to the garage in a daze. My belongings consisted of 3 suitcases and 2 cardboard boxes. 12 years of cohabitation reduced to 5 containers. I loaded them into my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the car Olivia had always made fun of, calling it my teacher mobile. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the house I'd helped turn into a home, and then I drove away. The extended stay hotel was off Highway 26, one of those places where the rooms smell like industrial cleaner and the walls are thin enough that you can hear every conversation in neighboring rooms. I spent 4 days there, mostly lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how my life had collapsed so completely. The check Richard had given me sat on the nightstand, $75,000. It seemed like so much and so little at the same time. In Portland, that wouldn't even cover a down payment on a decent apartment. First month, last month, security deposit, furniture. It would go fast. So fast. On the 5th day, I finally forced myself to go to the bank to deposit the check and start figuring out my next move. I drove to the Chase Bank branch on Morrison Street, the one I'd been banking at for years. I parked, grabbed my wallet, and started walking toward the entrance. That's when I saw it. The card I'd forgotten about for 23 years. I was pulling out my debit card when something else slid out with it and fell to the pavement. An old ATM card, so worn the numbers were barely visible. I picked it up, confused for a moment, and then I remembered my mother had given me this card the week before she died. Mom had been sick for almost a year before the cancer finally took her. I was 22, fresh out of college, trying to figure out my life. She'd raised me alone after my dad left when I was 3, working as a bookkeeper for small businesses around Portland, clipping coupons, shopping at Goodwill, making sure I had everything I needed even when we had almost nothing. The week before she died, I'd been sitting next to her hospital bed holding her hand. She'd been in and out of consciousness, the morphine making her drift. But on that particular afternoon, she'd squeezed my hand and opened her eyes. "Carter, baby, I need to tell you something important." I'd leaned in close. "What is it, Mom? You need more pain medication?" She'd reached over to her bedside table with trembling fingers and pulled out an ATM card. "This is for you, for when you really need it." "Mom, what is this?" "It's from an account I set up a long time ago. The PIN is your birthday. Month and day, not year, 0715, July 15th. I'd taken the card, confused. "Mom, what account? What money? Promise me something, Carter." She'd gripped my hand harder than I thought possible, given how weak she was. "Promise me you'll only use this when you have absolutely nothing left. When you're at rock bottom and need help. Not before then. Only when you truly need it. I promise," I'd said, not really understanding but not wanting to upset her. "Good boy." She closed her eyes again. "You're going to be okay, baby. You're going to be just fine." She'd died 2 days later. I'd put the card in my wallet and honestly forgot about it. I'd assumed it was maybe a small savings account with a few $1,000s she'd managed to squirrel away. I'd never checked because it felt wrong, like I'd be betraying her trust. But standing in that bank parking lot with $43 in my checking account and nowhere to live, I finally understood what she'd meant. This was rock bottom. This was absolutely nothing left. I walked up to the ATM machine outside the bank. It was old, one of those models from the early 2000s that somehow still worked. I slid my mother's card into the slot, half expecting it to be rejected. The magnetic strip was so worn, I had to try 3 times before it read, "Please enter your PIN." My hands were shaking as I typed. 0715, July 15th, my birthday. The machine took longer than normal to process, the screen just sitting there with a loading symbol spinning. I was about to cancel the transaction when the screen changed. "Balance inquiry not available at this terminal. Please see a banker for assistance." My stomach dropped. Great. The account was probably closed or flagged or something. 23 years was a long time. Of course it wouldn't work. I was pulling the card out when I heard the bank's front door slam open. A woman came running out, maybe mid-40s. Her name tag reading Jennifer Walsh, branch manager. She was literally running toward me, her face pale. "Sir," she called out, slightly breathless. "Sir, please don't leave. I need you to come inside immediately. Is there a problem with the card?" She stopped in front of me, and I could see her hands were shaking. "Sir, I need to verify some information. It's extremely urgent. Please come with me." Something in her voice made my heart start pounding. Had my mother been involved in something illegal? Was this account tied to fraud? I followed Jennifer inside, past the teller windows, past the waiting area, all the way to a private office in the back of the bank. She gestured for me to sit, then closed the door. Her hands were still shaking as she pulled up something on her computer. "Sir, can I please see some identification?" I handed her my driver's license. She compared it to whatever was on her screen, then looked at me like I was a ghost. Mr. Bennett, when was the last time you accessed this account? Never. My mother gave me the card 23 years ago, right before she died. I've never used it until just now. Jennifer sat back in her chair, and I watched her face go through about 6 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Mr. Bennett, the account you just tried to access. The current balance is $52,347,612. I actually laughed, out loud, because that was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. That's impossible. My mom was a bookkeeper. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment my entire childhood. She drove the same car for 15 years. There's no way. Jennifer turned her computer screen toward me. I saw an account summary with my mother's name at the top. Rebecca Ann Bennett. Mr. Bennett, your mother wasn't just a bookkeeper. According to these documents, she was the founding partner and primary shareholder of something called Cascade Ventures. Does that name mean anything to you? I shook my head, feeling like I was in a dream. Like I'd fallen asleep in that hotel room, and this was some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Jennifer pulled up another document. Cascade Ventures was a venture capital firm established in 1982. It made early-stage investments in several technology companies that became extremely successful. Intel, Microsoft, Adobe, Starbucks before it went national. Your mother's initial investment of $75,000 grew exponentially over 4 decades. That doesn't make sense. Why would she live the way we did if she had millions of dollars? Jennifer opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a sealed envelope. According to the account notes, your mother left specific instructions. You were not to be informed about the account until you accessed it yourself. And when you did, you were to be given this letter. She handed me an envelope that looked like it had been sitting in that drawer for over 2 decades. My mother's handwriting on the front. For Carter, when he needs it most. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. The paper inside was yellowed with age, but the words were clear as day. My dearest Carter, if you're reading this, it means you finally used the card. It means you've hit rock bottom, and I'm sorry I'm not there to help you through it. But maybe in a way I am. You're probably so confused right now. Let me explain everything. When I was 24 years old, I was working as a bookkeeper for a startup company called Cascade Ventures. It was just 3 guys in a garage, trying to figure out how to invest in technology companies they believed in. They couldn't afford to pay me a real salary, so the founder, David Chen, offered me equity in the company instead. I had no idea what that meant, Carter. I just needed the job. Those shares became worth millions when Cascade's investments started paying off. By the time you were born, I was already a multimillionaire on paper. By the time you were 10, I was worth more than I could ever spend in a lifetime. But I watched what money did to people, baby. I watched David's partners destroy their lives with cocaine and sports, cars and trophy wives. I watched families in our investment circle tear themselves apart over inheritance disputes. I watched good people become monsters because they had too much money and not enough purpose, so I made a choice. I would live simply, work hard, and save everything for you, but not to spoil you, not to make your life easy, to give you a safety net for when you really needed it. For when you hit bottom and needed a way back up, I set up this account with very specific instructions. You could only access it when you had nowhere else to turn. Because that's when money matters most, Carter. Not when you're comfortable, but when you're desperate. Not for luxuries, but for survival. For a second chance, the amount in this account is yours completely. No strings, no taxes, no restrictions. It's been sitting here waiting for you to need it. And if you're reading this letter, that time has come. Use it wisely, my beautiful boy. Not to buy things, but to build a life. To find yourself. To become the man I always knew you could be. Money doesn't make you valuable, Carter. Your heart does. Your kindness does. Your willingness to help people even when there's nothing in it for you. That's what makes you rich. I love you more than all the money in the world. More than every dollar in that account. More than anything. Mommy sat in Jennifer Walsh's office with tears streaming down my face, holding a letter from a mother who'd been dead for 23 years but had somehow known exactly when I'd need her. Who'd set up this impossible safety net and then lived like she had nothing, so I'd never take money for granted, Mr. Bennett, Jennifer said quietly. What would you like to do? What would I like to do? I thought about Olivia sitting in her house, probably already dating someone new, someone more successful, someone more worthy of her. I thought about Richard Holbrook with his condescending smile and his $75,000 consolation prize. I thought about how small they tried to make me feel, and I started to laugh. "Ms. Walsh," I said, wiping my eyes, "I need to hire a lawyer, the best divorce lawyer in Portland. Money is no object." The look on Olivia's face when Richard Holbrook called her 3 days later was apparently something people in her office were still talking about weeks afterward. I know because her assistant Marcus, who I'd always treated with respect and who'd watched Olivia treat me like garbage for years, sent me a text. She threw her coffee mug across the conference room and it shattered against the wall. Then she screamed at Richard for 10 straight minutes. What the hell did you do to her? What I'd done was hire Elizabeth Brennan, the attorney who'd built her entire career on destroying bullies like Richard Holbrook in court. She charged $1,200 an hour, and after our first consultation, I'd paid her a $50,000 retainer without blinking. "Mr. Bennett," Elizabeth had said during that first meeting in her downtown office, "you signed away your rights to marital assets under duress. You were given less than 2 hours to make a decision, explicitly prevented from consulting with your own attorney, and threatened with financial ruin if you didn't accept immediately. That's textbook coercion, but I signed the papers. Doesn't that make it legally binding?" She smiled. "Not if I can prove the agreement was unconscionable. $75,000 for 12 years of marriage where you contributed your entire income to household expenses and enabled your wife to focus on building her career. A first-year law student could get that overturned." Elizabeth filed an emergency motion to set aside the divorce settlement based on coercion, unconscionability, duress, and failure to provide adequate financial disclosure. She also demanded complete discovery of all marital assets, including ones Olivia might have hidden. That the hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks. Out in the meantime, I used my mother's gift to rent a beautiful loft apartment in the Pearl District, not far from the house I'd shared with Olivia. Floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed brick, a view of the city that made me feel like I could breathe again. I bought furniture, real furniture that I actually liked, not the minimalist designer pieces Olivia had insisted on that made our house feel like a museum instead of a home. I also started calling people I'd lost touch with over the years. My college roommate Derek, who Olivia had always found too loud and unsophisticated. My sister Michelle, who I'd barely seen in 5 years because Olivia found family gatherings tedious. My old hiking buddies from my 20s, who'd slowly disappeared from my life as Olivia's work events and networking dinners took priority. They all welcomed me back like I'd been released from prison. "Carter, man," Derek said when we met for beers at our old favorite brewery. "I have to be honest with you. We all saw what she was doing. You just kept getting smaller and quieter every year. It's good to see you standing up straight again." The court hearing was on a Thursday morning in early November. I wore a suit I'd bought myself, not expensive but clean and professional. Elizabeth met me outside the courthouse, looking like she was about to enjoy herself immensely. "Remember," she said, "don't engage. Don't react. Let me do all the talking." Olivia showed up 15 minutes late in full corporate power mode. Valentino suite Louboutin heels, her hair styled in that severe bun she wore when she wanted to intimidate people. Richard Holbrook was at her side, looking significantly less confident than the last time I'd seen him. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a woman in her early 60s with a reputation for absolute intolerance of legal bullying. She'd been a family law attorney for 30 years before being appointed to the bench, and she'd seen every dirty trick in the book. And reviewed the emergency motion and the original settlement agreement. Judge Morrison began, "Mr. Holbrook, would you like to explain to me why your client offered Mr. Bennett only $75,000 for a 12-year marriage?" Richard stood, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, the settlement reflected the relative financial contributions to the marriage. Mrs. Bennett earned significantly more throughout the duration of the marriage and funded the majority of major purchases and investments." Judge Morrison cut him off. "I can read the financial disclosures, Mr. Holbrook. What concerns me is the timeline. Mr. Bennett was given less than 2 hours to accept or reject the offer, was explicitly told he could not consult with an attorney, and was threatened with financial ruin if he proceeded to trial. In what universe does that constitute good faith negotiation?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, we were attempting to expedite the dissolution process to minimize costs and emotional distress for both parties. You were attempting to coerce a settlement from an unrepresented party, the judge said flatly. Ms. Brennan, I'm granting your motion. The settlement agreement is set aside. This case will proceed to trial for proper equitable distribution of marital assets. Olivia's face went red. She leaned over and whispered something harsh to Richard, who whispered back and shook his head. She stood up abruptly. Your Honor, I'd like to address the court. Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. This is highly irregular, Mrs. Bennett. I understand that. But this is my marriage and my money. I have a right to be heard. The judge gestured for her to proceed, and I saw Elizabeth smile slightly beside me. Olivia turned to face me, and her expression was pure fury. Carter, what the hell are you doing? You accepted the settlement. You signed the papers. You don't get to change your mind. Now, just because you're having regrets, I stood up, and Elizabeth put a hand on my arm, but I gently moved it away. Your Honor, may I respond? Judge Morrison nodded. I looked at Olivia, really looked at her, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no bitterness, no lingering love. Just nothing. Liv, I'm not doing this because I regret signing. I'm doing this because what you did was wrong. You bullied me into accepting an unconscionable settlement. Because you thought I was weak. Because you thought I had no options. Because you genuinely believed I was worthless without you. Her eyes narrowed. So what, Carter? You suddenly grew a spine? Where was this backbone when we were married? My mother left me something, Olivia. An inheritance I didn't know about. And it turns out I have plenty of options now, including the option to fight you in court for as long as it takes to get what's actually fair. Her face went pale. What inheritance? That's none of your concern, Elizabeth said, standing. But I can tell you this, Your Honor, Mr. Bennett is no longer in a position where he must accept whatever crumbs are offered to him. He can afford the best representation. He can afford to take this case to trial. He can afford to demand justice. Richard jumped up. Your Honor, Mr. Bennett's newfound wealth is completely irrelevant to the distribution of marital assets acquired during the marriage. Actually, Mr. Holbrook, it's extremely relevant, Elizabeth countered. It proves your threats of financial ruin were empty. It proves my client is not fighting from a position of weakness. He's fighting from a position of principle. Judge Morrison was watching the exchange with obvious interest. This case will proceed to trial. I'm ordering both parties to submit complete financial disclosure within 30 days, including any assets acquired before, during, or immediately after separation. We'll reconvene in 90 days for a case management conference. The trial lasted almost 5 weeks, and it was absolutely glorious. Elizabeth Brennan systematically destroyed every argument Richard Holbrook made. She brought in my colleagues from Lincoln High who testified about the hours I'd worked supporting Olivia's career. The dinners I'd hosted for her clients where I'd played perfect husband, making everyone comfortable, making her look good. The presentations I'd edited at 2 a.m. The household I'd run, single-handedly so she could focus on climbing the corporate ladder. She brought in financial experts who testified that $75,000 for 12 years of marriage, where one spouse earned significantly more but both contributed to the marital partnership, was not just unfair but punitive and vindictive. She brought in a therapist who specialized in coercive relationships and who testified about the psychological impact of being told you're worthless, being isolated from friends and family, being made to feel like you should be grateful for crumbs. She even found Olivia's college roommate, who testified that Olivia had specifically targeted me because she wanted someone who would never overshadow her success, someone who would always be grateful to be with her. Richard fought hard. I'll give him that. But he was outmatched and he knew it. Elizabeth was relentless, prepared, and she had truth on her side. The day of the verdict, the courtroom was more crowded than I expected. Some of Olivia's colleagues curious about the outcome, some of my friends from school there to support me. My sister Michelle sitting in the front row, giving me a thumbs up. Judge Morrison read her decision with no preamble, no unnecessary commentary. After reviewing all testimony and evidence presented, this court finds that the original settlement agreement was unconscionable and obtained through coercion and duress. The court orders the following distribution of marital assets. The marital home to be sold with proceeds divided equally. All investment accounts to be divided equally. All vehicles to be sold with proceeds divided equally. Mrs. Bennett is ordered to pay Mr. Bennett $625,000 in spousal support to equalize the settlement and compensate for opportunity cost and career support provided during the marriage. Mr. Bennett is entitled to 50% of Mrs. Bennett's pension and retirement accounts. This order is effective immediately. Olivia looked like she'd been physically slapped. $625,000 on top of half of everything. It was probably close to $4 million total once everything was divided and sold. But the money wasn't even the point. The point was the look on her face when she realized I wasn't the weak, insufficient man she'd thought I was. The point was standing up for myself for the first time in 12 years. The point was my mother, 23 years dead, still protecting me after the verdict. I walked out of that courthouse into November rain, and it felt like baptism. Elizabeth was beside me, grinning with satisfaction. You did good in there, Carter. Most people would have taken that settlement and spent the rest of their lives bitter and angry. You fought back. My mom taught me to only use her gift when I had absolutely nothing left, I said. Turns out having nothing left was exactly what I needed to find myself again. 6 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Northwest Portland, the same coffee shop where I'd met Olivia 15 years ago. I'd gone back to work at Lincoln High, not because I needed the money, but because teaching had always been my passion. It was never something I did because I couldn't do anything better. It was something I chose because it mattered. I was grading essays for my senior AP literature class when someone sat down at the table next to mine. A woman with dark curly hair, probably my age, struggling with an ancient laptop that clearly wasn't cooperating. Without thinking, I reached over. If you hold the power button for 10 seconds, it'll force restart. Sometimes these older models get stuck. She tried it and the laptop hummed back to life. Oh my God, thank you so much. I'm completely useless with technology. No problem. I'm Carter. She smiled, and it was genuine and warm. I'm Sophia. Are you a teacher? I saw the essays. Guilty. High school. English and college prep counseling. That's amazing. My brother's a teacher. He always says it's the hardest job he's ever loved. We talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. She was a physical therapist at Legacy Emmanuel, recently divorced. Funny and real and down to earth in ways Olivia had never been. When we finally parted ways, she'd written her number on a coffee shop napkin and told me to text her if I ever wanted to do this again. I folded that napkin carefully and put it in my wallet, right next to my mother's card. That night, I stood in my apartment looking out at Portland's lights, thinking about the impossible journey from that hotel room to here. The money my mother left me had saved my life. But more than that, it had taught me something invaluable. Your worth isn't measured in salary or status or square footage. It's measured in the lives you touch, the kindness you show, the person you choose to be when no one's looking. Olivia had tried to convince me I was nothing without her money and her success. My mother, 23 years dead, had proven that I'd always been enough. I still had most of the inheritance sitting untouched in investments that would grow over time. I didn't need a mansion or a luxury car or designer suits. I had enough to live comfortably, to pursue my passion, to help students who needed it, to make a difference. The divorce was final. Olivia had her company and her success and her belief that worth was measured in dollars. And I had something infinitely more valuable, my dignity, my peace, my purpose, and a future that belonged entirely to me. My mother had been right about everything. The money mattered most when I had nothing left. Because having nothing was when I discovered that everything I actually needed was already inside me. The lesson here isn't about money, although that's the obvious takeaway. It's about knowing your worth. It's about refusing to accept someone else's valuation of you. It's about understanding that true wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with who you are when everything's been stripped away. Olivia couldn't destroy me because I was never built on her foundation to begin with. I was built on my mother's love, on meaningful work, on genuine connections, and no divorce lawyer or settlement agreement or cruel words could take that away. So here's what I learned standing outside that bank at 3 in the morning with a worn ATM card in my hand. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover you were never empty to begin with. Sometimes rock bottom is actually solid ground, and sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who wait until we're ready to save ourselves before they step in to help. My mother knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't leave me money to make my life easier. She left me money to make sure. I could stand back up when someone tried to knock me down, and I did.